On July 10, 1942, Lieutenant William Thies was lost over the Aleutian Islands. His PBY Catalina patrol plane had been navigating by dead reckoning through thick fog, and somewhere over the endless Alaskan waters, he'd drifted off course. When the Shumagan Islands appeared through a break in the clouds, Thies reoriented and turned toward the most direct route back to Dutch Harbor. That route took him over Akutan Island, a desolate volcanic rock covered in muskeg swamp that nobody ever flew over. Then his plane captain, Albert Knack, spotted something impossible below. An aircraft, belly up in the swamp. The distinctive lines of a Japanese Zero fighter. Thies banked the PBY into a tight circle. From 500 feet, he could see the aircraft was intact. Not destroyed, not burned, just sitting inverted in the marsh like someone had carefully placed it there. The red Hinomaru roundels on the wings were clearly visible. This was the aircraft that had dominated Pacific skies for 8 months. The fighter American pilots called unbeatable. Thies marked the position on his map and headed back to Dutch Harbor. He knew what he'd found. Inside that crashed fighter was the answer to why American pilots kept dying. The secret to understanding how the Zero turned, how it climbed, where it was vulnerable. But first, he'd have to convince his commanding officer that a wrecked enemy fighter in a remote swamp was worth the enormous effort to recover. He'd have to organize one of the most important salvage operations of World War II. And he'd have to do it before the Japanese realized what they'd left behind. What Thies didn't know was that the Japanese pilot who'd made that landing had executed it perfectly, and that perfect emergency landing would kill more Japanese pilots than any single American ace. Before we continue, I'd love to know if you've ever heard this story. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from, and if this story is new to you. And if you're enjoying these deep dives into aviation history that changed everything, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next one. These stories take serious research to get every detail right, and knowing you're out there makes it worthwhile. To understand why one crashed Zero mattered so much, you need to understand the situation American pilots faced in mid-1942. Since Pearl Harbor, Japanese Zero fighters had shot down American aircraft at a ratio of roughly 3-to-1, sometimes worse. The Zero could turn inside anything the United States flew. It could climb faster than American fighters. It was more maneuverable at every altitude. American pilots knew the Zero was dangerous, but they didn't know why. They didn't know the Zero had no armor plating. They didn't know its fuel tanks weren't self-sealing. They didn't know that above 230 miles per hour, the Zero's ailerons became so stiff that pilots could barely roll the aircraft. They just knew that when they got into a turning fight with a Zero, they died. Squadron after squadron learned this the hard way. Get into a dogfight. Try to outturn the Zero. Watch the tracers coming at you. Never make it home. The Navy needed answers. They needed to understand this aircraft. They needed to know how to kill it. And in June 1942, a Japanese pilot named Tadayoshi Koga was about to give them exactly what they needed. June 4th, 1942. While the Battle of Midway raged 1,200 miles to the south, Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga prepared for what should have been a routine mission. Koga was an experienced pilot assigned to the aircraft carrier Ryujo. His mission was part of a diversionary attack on Dutch Harbor, a U.S. Navy installation in Alaska's Aleutian Islands. While American attention focused on Midway, Japanese forces would strike Alaska, potentially opening a northern invasion route. Koga flew an A6M2 Model 210, one of 19 fighters escorting bombers to Dutch harbor. The attack went well. Japanese bombers hit fuel tanks and military installations. American anti-aircraft fire was heavy, but largely ineffective. Then, Koga's luck changed. A single bullet from a ground-based machine gun struck his aircraft. Not a catastrophic hit, just one round that punched through the fuselage and severed a return oil line from his Nakajima Sake engine. The engine didn't explode. It didn't seize immediately. It just started losing oil pressure, which meant it would fail soon. Koga couldn't make it back to the Ryujo. He needed to land immediately. He spotted what looked like a flat, grassy area on nearby Akutan Island. Emergency landing protocols were clear. He should ditch in the ocean where rescue was possible, but the island looked better. Soft ground, no trees visible. He made his choice. Koga lined up his approach, dropped his Zero toward the green meadow, kept his speed steady. Every pilot trains for emergency landings. Lower the gear, cut the engine at the last moment. Let the aircraft settle onto the grass. Except it wasn't grass, it was muskeg, thick, waterlogged swamp vegetation covering deep mud. The kind of terrain that looks solid from the air but has the consistency of wet sponge. Koga's Zero touched down on what should have been solid ground. Instead, the landing gear immediately sank into the soft muskeg. The deceleration was instantaneous and violent. The nose pitched forward. The tail lifted. For a moment, the Zero balanced on its propeller and landing gear, suspended at an impossible angle. Then physics took over. The aircraft flipped, completely inverted. The canopy drove into the soft ground. The tail rose into the air, then settled back down with the Zero resting upside down in the swamp. The whole sequence took perhaps 3 seconds. Tadayoshi Koga died on impact. Medical examiners would later determine his neck broke from the sudden deceleration. Death was instantaneous. He never knew that his final flight would change the course of the Pacific War. But here's what made this crash extraordinary. The Zero remained almost completely intact. The soft muskeg cushioned the impact. The fuselage didn't crumple. The wings didn't tear off. Even the tail section stayed attached. The aircraft sat upside down, perfectly preserved, in one of the most remote locations in North America. Japanese search aircraft flew over the area repeatedly in the following days. They spotted Koga's Zero from the air, recognized it was wrecked, and reported it destroyed. They never sent a ground team. They never verified its condition. They assumed, reasonably, that an upside-down aircraft in an Alaskan swamp wasn't worth recovering. The Zero sat there for 5 weeks. Rain fell. Fog rolled in. The aircraft settled deeper into the muskeg. No one touched it. No one examined it. One of Japan's most advanced weapons lay abandoned in enemy territory, and neither side knew what they had. When Thies landed at Dutch harbor and reported what he'd found, his commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Paul Foley, was skeptical. A Japanese Zero, intact, in an Alaskan swamp? It sounded too good to be true. How intact? Foley asked. Thies described what he'd seen. Upside down, but the fuselage appeared solid. Wings attached. No fire damage. From the air, it looked recoverable. Foley knew what this could mean. American pilots were dying because they didn't understand the Zero. Engineers had never examined one intact. Intelligence officers had never studied its construction in detail. But recovery would be difficult. Akutan Island was remote. The terrain was impossible. It would take weeks of work for uncertain results. Thies made his case. He'd seen enough from the air to know this wasn't ordinary wreckage. This was a complete aircraft, preserved by soft ground. If they could recover it, they could test it. They could learn its weaknesses, They could save American lives. Foley authorized the mission. The next day, July 11th, Thies flew back to Akutan with a salvage team and Navy photographer's mate, Arthur Baumann. When they reached the crash site on foot, trudging through the muskeg, Thies's assessment proved correct. The Zero was upside down with its canopy buried in mud. The wings showed bullet holes from the Dutch harbor attack, but the structure was sound. The engine looked undamaged. The control surfaces were intact. This wasn't just recoverable. This was flyable if they could get it out of the swamp and repair the damage. They found Koga's body still in the cockpit. His neck had broken from the impact. They removed him carefully and buried him on Akutan Island with military honors. Even in death, even though he was an enemy, he'd died serving his country. They could respect that. Then came the hard part. The Zero weighed over 5,000 pounds. It sat in terrain that could barely support a man's weight, much less heavy equipment. The nearest road was miles away. They would have to build access routes, construct work platforms, and somehow flip the aircraft without destroying it. The recovery operation took 3 weeks. Navy construction crews built roads through the swamp using logs and gravel. They erected platforms around the Zero to distribute weight. They carefully excavated the buried canopy section. They built wooden cradles to support the fuselage during the flip. On August 12th, they finally had the Zero secured, righted, and ready for transport. They loaded it onto a barge, shipped it to Dutch Harbor, then to Seattle, and finally sent it by rail to Naval Air Station San Diego. By September, the Zero that Koga had crashed on a remote Alaskan island sat in a California hangar, about to reveal every secret that had made it unbeatable. Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders walked around the Zero for the 10th time that morning. As the Navy's chief test pilot at San Diego, he'd flown dozens of aircraft types, but he'd never expected to fly an enemy fighter. The restoration team had done remarkable work. They'd cleaned the mud from the engine, replaced damaged hydraulic lines, repaired the landing gear that had collapsed in the muskeg. The Zero looked almost factory fresh, painted in its original green camouflage with the red Hinomaru roundels still visible on the wings. On September 20th, 1942, Sanders climbed into the cockpit for the first test flight. The canopy slid forward. The Nakajima engine caught and roared to life. He taxied to the runway, advanced the throttle, and lifted the most intact enemy fighter in American possession into California skies. What Sanders discovered in the next 30 minutes would change everything American pilots thought they knew about fighting the Zero. The aircraft was extraordinary in some ways. At low speed, it turned incredibly tight. The climb rate was phenomenal. At certain altitudes, it could climb almost vertically. The visibility from the cockpit was excellent. Sanders could see in nearly every direction. But then, he pushed the Zero faster. Above 230 miles per hour, something changed. The control stick became harder to move. The ailerons, which controlled roll, required enormous force. At 250 miles per hour, Sanders could barely roll the aircraft at all. The Zero's legendary maneuverability vanished at high speed. He pushed into a dive. The Zero accelerated quickly, but as speed increased past 300 miles per hour, the controls became dangerously stiff. The aircraft wanted to pull itself into a tighter and tighter spiral. Sanders had to use both hands on the stick to prevent the Zero from rolling inverted. Recovering from high-speed dives was nearly impossible. Then Sanders fired the guns. The Zero carried two 7.7mm machine guns and two 20mm cannons. Impressive armament. But Sanders immediately noticed something critical. There was no armor plating protecting the pilot. The seat was unprotected. A single bullet hitting the cockpit would kill the pilot instantly. He examined the fuel tanks. They weren't self-sealing. American aircraft had rubber-lined fuel tanks that would seal themselves if punctured. The Zero's tanks were plain aluminum. One tracer round through a fuel tank, and the entire aircraft would become a fireball. Sanders landed after 40 minutes of flight testing. He'd discovered the Zero's greatest weaknesses. The information he'd gathered would save hundreds of American lives. The Navy immediately classified Sanders's findings as top secret and began distributing tactical bulletins to every fighter squadron in the Pacific. The information was simple. Never dogfight with a Zero. Never try to outturn it at low speed. Use speed and altitude. Dive in, shoot, climb away. The new tactics worked. American pilots who followed the guidelines started surviving their encounters. Kill ratios began to improve. The Zero was still dangerous, but it was no longer invincible. But here's what nobody anticipated. The captured Zero created a deadly new problem. American pilots started getting overconfident. They knew the Zero couldn't roll at high speed. They knew one tracer through the fuel tank meant certain destruction. They knew the pilot had no armor protection. So they started pressing attacks too long, getting too close, taking risks they never would have taken before. In October 1942, 3 American pilots died in a single week because they followed a damaged Zero down through clouds, certain they had an easy kill. The Zero pilot, knowing exactly what Americans now expected, reversed hard at low altitude. All 3 American aircraft, traveling too fast to turn with the Zero, overshot and were shot down. Japanese pilots noticed something had changed. American tactics shifted suddenly in September 1942. Instead of trying to dogfight, American pilots began using pure energy tactics. Dive attacks, high-speed passes, zoom climbs. They stopped playing to the Zero's strengths, but Japanese pilots also noticed American overconfidence. They started using the Zero's remaining advantages more aggressively. Extreme low-speed maneuvering, unexpected reversals. Exploiting the brief moments when American pilots assumed victory was certain. The Navy realized they'd created a training problem. It wasn't enough to tell pilots about the Zero's weaknesses. They needed to show them. They needed pilots to experience firsthand what the Zero could and couldn't do. So they did something unprecedented. They began flying the captured Zero in mock combat against American fighters. Squadron after squadron sent their best pilots to San Diego to dogfight against the real thing. Not a simulation, not a description, the actual aircraft. Pilots learned the hard way that knowing the Zero's weaknesses didn't mean the fight was easy. They learned respect for the aircraft. They learned exactly when they could push and when they needed to break off. They learned that the Zero was beatable, but only if you fought it correctly. The impact of the captured Zero on Pacific air combat was immediate and dramatic. Within 3 months of the test flights beginning, American kill ratios against Japanese fighters improved from 3-to-1 in Japan's favor to nearly even. By mid-1943, American pilots were shooting down Japanese aircraft at rates of 10-to-1. The tactics developed from studying Koga's Zero became standard doctrine. The Thak weave, a defensive formation that used mutual support to counter the Zero's turning advantage, was validated through mock combat against the captured aircraft. Boom and zoom tactics, using American aircraft's superior speed and diving performance, became the standard approach. New aircraft designs incorporated lessons learned from the Zero. When Grumman designed the F-6F Hellcat, they specifically addressed the Zero's strengths. The Hellcat had armor protection, self-sealing fuel tanks, and could roll quickly at high speed. It could absorb damage that would destroy a Zero. And it could dive away from any fight, and the Zero couldn't follow. The Hellcat's combat record against the Zero was devastating. In its first major engagement, Hellcats shot down 30 Japanese aircraft without a single American loss. The ratio continued. By the end of the war, Hellcats had destroyed over 5,000 Japanese aircraft with a kill ratio of 19-1. Japanese commanders noticed the shift, but couldn't understand what had changed. American pilots suddenly seemed to know exactly how to fight the Zero. They exploited every weakness. They avoided every strength. It was as if the Americans had been given a manual on how to kill the Zero. In a sense, they had. The Navy's tactical bulletins, based entirely on testing Koga's Zero, were exactly that. A detailed instruction manual on destroying Japan's primary fighter. Japanese intelligence investigated. They questioned captured American pilots. They examined shot-down American aircraft for new equipment. They analyzed combat reports for patterns. They never discovered the Americans had an intact Zero. They never realized that every tactical advantage they'd enjoyed from 1941 to mid-1942 had been systematically analyzed and countered. The captured Zero flew for over a year, accumulating hundreds of test flight hours. Dozens of pilots flew it. Engineers took it apart and measured every component. Metallurgists analyzed its construction. Intelligence officers photographed every detail. On February 15, 1945, the Zero's test flight career ended. Flying near San Diego, the Nakajima engine finally failed. The pilot made an emergency landing, but the aircraft was too damaged to repair. It had served its purpose. The information it provided had already changed the Pacific Air War. Tadayoshi Koga's body was recovered from the Zero's cockpit during the initial salvage operation in July 1942. He was buried with military honors on Akutan Island, in recognition that even though he was an enemy, he'd died in combat, serving his country. His family in Japan knew only that he'd been shot down during the Aleutian campaign. They didn't know where. They didn't know his aircraft had been captured. For decades after the war, Koga's relatives had no details about his final mission or burial location. In the 1970s, American researchers finally contacted Koga's family and provided information about his crash site and burial. Japanese veterans organizations arranged for his remains to be repatriated to Japan, where he was buried with full military honors in his family's plot. William Thies never received official recognition for his role in recovering the Zero. His fight to salvage the aircraft went unrecorded in official histories. His name appears in no military citations. He returned to civilian life after the war and died in 1972 without ever speaking publicly about his contribution to the war effort. Eddie Sanders continued as a Navy test pilot throughout the war. He flew dozens of captured enemy aircraft, including Japanese bombers and German fighters. He survived the war and later worked as a commercial airline pilot. In interviews decades later, he described the captured Zero as the most important aircraft he'd ever flown. Not because it was the best, but because testing it saved more American lives than anything else he did during the war. The Zero itself, damaged beyond repair after its 1945 engine failure, was scrapped for parts. For decades, historians believed no physical trace remained. But in 1988, researchers discovered that major components had been saved. The engine, portions of the fuselage, and several control surfaces had been stored in a Navy warehouse and forgotten. Those components were eventually restored and are now on display at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. You can see Koga's Zero today. The red Hinomaru roundel is still visible on the wing. The bullet holes from Dutch Harbor are still present in the fuselage. The engine that failed over Akutan Island sits beside the display, preserved exactly as it was recovered from the swamp. The Akutan Zero changed the Pacific War in ways that are difficult to quantify. How many American pilots survived because they knew not to dogfight with a Zero? How many lives were saved because the Hellcat was designed specifically to counter the Zero's strengths? How many Japanese pilots died because American tactics exploited weaknesses they didn't know existed? The numbers are impossible to calculate precisely, but aviation historians estimate that the captured Zero improved American combat effectiveness by at least 30%. That translates to thousands of American lives saved and thousands of additional Japanese aircraft destroyed, all because Tadayoshi Koga made a perfect emergency landing in an Alaskan swamp. All because William Thies fought Navy bureaucracy to recover what others called worthless wreckage. All because Eddie Sanders flew an enemy aircraft and documented exactly what made it vulnerable. The story illustrates something fundamental about warfare and intelligence. The most valuable information isn't always the most obvious. A single intact aircraft, recovered from a swamp that most officers wanted to ignore, provided more tactical intelligence than dozens of combat reports and hundreds of debriefings. Japanese commanders spent the rest of the war trying to understand why American tactics changed so dramatically in September 1942. They developed dozens of theories: new training programs, superior equipment, better pilots. They never imagined the Americans had captured an intact Zero and systematically analyzed every aspect of its performance. That's the final irony of the Akutan Zero. The aircraft that dominated Pacific skies for 8 months became the tool of its own defeat. Every strength that made it successful, its tight turning, its climb rate, its low-speed agility, became irrelevant once American pilots learned to avoid those situations and exploit the Zero's weaknesses instead. Today, when you visit the Smithsonian and see pieces of Koga's Zero on display, you're looking at one of the most consequential artifacts of World War II. Not a famous ship, not a weapon that ended battles, just a fighter plane that crashed in a swamp and taught the Americans how to win. Lieutenant William Thies was right when he circled that wreck from his PBY and recognized what he'd found. That crashed Zero sitting in a remote Alaskan swamp was worth more than a dozen battleships. He just had to convince his commanding officer that what looked like wreckage from 500 feet up was actually the key to winning the Pacific Air War. And somewhere in Japan, Tadayoshi Koga's family maintains his grave, honoring a pilot who served his country with honor. They probably don't know that his final flight, his perfectly executed emergency landing, changed the course of the war in ways he never could have imagined. His skill as a pilot, demonstrated in his last moments, gave his enemies exactly what they needed to win.